From Commodity to Asset, the truth behind rising house prices. I'm Blair Fix. Practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influence are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. John Maynard Keynes, 1936. When it comes to rising house prices, nearly everyone has a theory about the cause. There's too much foreign money, there are too many immigrants, there's too little construction, and so on. What unites these explanations is that they appeal in some way to the idea that rising prices are caused by a mismatch between supply and demand. And surely that's true, right? Yes, it is true. In the same way that death is caused by dying. But of course, that's circular logic. And so it goes with supply and demand. Since prices are always caused by the interplay between what we want and what we can get, evoking supply and demand leads us pretty much nowhere. Worse, it often puts the focus on short-term patterns when the real scientific payoff lies in studying price trends over the long term. Speaking of the long term, many people assume that rising house prices are a recent problem. But in the United States, the pattern dates to the early 1970s. For almost a century before that, U.S. house prices had been dropping against income. And so Americans treated their house like a commodity, a thing they bought to live in. But from 1972 onward, house prices began to slowly appreciate against income. And so Americans started to treat their house like an asset. It's this transformation from commodity-like depreciation to asset-like appreciation that is the real story of house prices. And the truth is that this story can't be understood using popular scapegoats. To see why U.S. house prices headed south and then north, we need to forget about supply and demand and instead peer into the belly of industrialism. We need to ground house prices in the use of energy. Now, if going from prices to energy sounds like a non sequitur, I'll show you why it makes sense. And I'll show you how, when we bring debt into the energy fold, we can explain almost all of the historical variation in U.S. house prices. The lesson here is simple yet disturbing. When it comes to rising house prices, the trend has less to do with a supply crisis and more to do with basic physical limits to industrial supply chains. The price behavior of commodities and assets. Before we dive into the changing nature of house prices, it's helpful to start with a more general question. What's the difference between a commodity and an asset? On this topic, there's much confusion, and that's largely because the distinction between the two concepts is ideological. It has less to do with the things themselves and more to do with the goal of ownership. People buy commodities to use them, but they buy an asset as an investment. Crucially, these goals depend circularly on prices. In other words, what makes people treat property like a commodity is that its value depreciates over time. And what makes people treat other property like an asset is that its value appreciates over time. Take cars as an example. Most cars lose value over time, a fact that makes people treat them like a commodity. If you buy a car, it's because you want to drive it. That said, some cars, old Ferraris for example, get more valuable with time. When a collector buys one of these cars, they might never get behind the wheel. Instead, they treat the thing as an asset, a ledger line whose purpose is to appreciate in value. Now, when we talk about depreciation and appreciation, we usually mean of a thing's nominal price. However, when we look at long-term trends, nominal prices aren't useful because inflation makes everything appreciate in value. So to study long-term price patterns, we need a goalpost that moves with the times. In this post, I'll use average income as the benchmark. When we judge prices against average income, we find a clear distinction between property that's considered a commodity and property that's considered an asset. The price of a commodity-like property tends to depreciate against income, while the price of asset-like property tends to oscillate. Let's visualize these patterns using historical data. We'll start with the price of commodity-like property, shown in Figure 1. Here I've pegged the U.S. Consumer Price Index against the average American income. As you can see, the price of these consumer items depreciated drastically over the last 2 centuries. Turning to asset-like property, we know that the same depreciation pattern can't hold. If it did, investors would always lose their shirts and capitalism would have long ago collapsed. Since capitalism lives on for now, we can deduce that asset-like property follows a different pricing pattern. To see this pattern, let's look at the price of corporate stocks, shown in Figure 2. Here I've pegged the value of the S&P 500 against the average U.S. income. The result is a long-term oscillation. Over the last century, stock prices kept pace with rising American income, albeit with some big swings in investors' fortunes. It's because of this price-holding pattern that corporate stocks are treated as an asset. That's not the only reason, of course. To summarize, long-term price patterns tell us about how people view their property. If property consistently loses value against income, it's treated as a commodity, a thing you buy to use. But if property maintains its value against income, it gets treated as an asset, a thing you buy as an investment. U.S. house prices, from commodity to asset. Now to housing. When we peg the price of U.S. houses against the average American income, what pattern will we find? Will house prices depreciate like a commodity, or will they maintain their value like an asset? Turning to the historical data, the answer is both. Figure 3 runs the numbers. From 1890 to 1972, U.S. house prices behaved like a commodity, consistently declining against the average American income. But after 1972, U.S. house prices behaved like an asset, slowly appreciating against income. Before we search for the cause of this house price transformation, it's worth commenting on the difference between the two price environments. In today's asset-like environment, the game is to buy a house before prices outpace your income. For many people, a house purchase requires borrowing or inheriting money from parents, as well as taking on Herculean levels of debt. In contrast, 2 generations ago, American house buyers pursued a different strategy. In the commodity-like environment of the 1950s, purchasing a house was similar to buying consumer electronics today. The expectation, and the reality, was that each year houses got cheaper relative to income. This depreciation meant that real estate was not a game of investment, and there was no pressure to buy now. If you wanted a house, you simply waited for prices to drop such that you could afford one. My, how things have changed. Case temporarily closed. Let's turn now to what's driving the trend in U.S. house prices. For their part, mainstream economists already know the answer. Prices, they say, are everywhere and always caused by the interplay of supply and demand. As such, the task is to take this predetermined hypothesis and find data to support it. For the moment, I'll play the game. To quantify the supply of U.S. houses, I'll look at the pace of construction, measured in terms of the number of housing starts. And to quantify the demand for new houses, I'll use the annual change in U.S. population. The idea is that when the population grows, so does the demand for housing. So if the supply of new houses stagnates while the population expands, people will bid up prices and houses will get more expensive. It's simple economics, and it's supported by evidence. Figure 4 runs the numbers. Here the gray curve shows the number of U.S. housing starts, measured relative to the annual change in U.S. population. The red curve illustrates the trend in this data, a trend which conspicuously mirrors the long-term pattern in U.S. house prices. As construction rates increased, house prices dropped, and when construction stagnated, house prices gradually rose. And there we have it, folks. The case is closed. The problem of rising house prices is caused by a mismatch between supply and demand. I kid, of course. For at least 3 reasons, I find this standard explanation dissatisfying. First, the correlation in figure 4 is not compelling. Notice that I had to smooth the construction data to see that it resembles the house price data. If prices were completely determined by the interplay of supply and demand, data smoothing should be unrequired. Second, the appeal to supply and demand raises more questions than it answers. For example, if an expanding population requires more houses, why doesn't the construction industry supply them automatically? After all, that's what we'd expect in a fairy tale free market. Confusingly, there are moments in U.S. history when housing construction far outpaced population growth. And there are other moments when the construction industry dropped the ball. Why? If the investigation begins and ends with supply and demand, we'll never know the answer. Third, it seems plausible that in figure 3, cause and effect might be reversed. Instead of construction rates driving prices, it could be that house prices drive the pace of construction. In other words, it's people's willingness to buy new houses that sets the pace of new house construction. So when prices rise, people become less willing to buy, hence fewer new houses get built. In short, when I see an explanation based on supply and demand, it's like finding a sealed box labeled "Interesting thing inside, do not open." I am, of course, going to open it. How stuff gets cheaper. To peer inside the sealed box of house prices, we need to leave supply and demand behind and instead start with a basic question. How does stuff get cheaper? The answer is that there are two main routes. To reduce prices, businesses can either increase workers' productivity or they can slash workers' wages. If these two routes seem obvious to you, feel free to skip ahead. But for detail-oriented readers, here's the math. In economics, nearly all obvious truths start from accounting definitions. Equations for a commodity's price are no exception. To define a price, we'll begin with the basics of double-entry bookkeeping. When you buy something, your expense becomes someone else's income. As such, we can define a commodity's price by adding up this income and then dividing by the number of commodities sold. Let's assume that it's a firm who receives this income. From its gross income, the firm then sends money to its owners, its employees, and its suppliers. Of these expenses, payments to workers typically dominate. So to simplify the math, we'll pretend that the worker payroll is the only expense. Hence, in rough terms, a commodity's price is set by the size of the firm's payroll per item sold. Next, we note that a firm's payroll is set by the number of workers it employs, multiplied by their average pay. So we can update our price equation as follows. Finally, note that if we divide the number of commodities sold by the number of workers employed, we're calculating worker productivity. Looking at our price equation, we've got the inverse of this quantity. So with a quick substitution, we get our final formula. Now let's return to our original question. How do commodities get cheaper? According to our equation, there are two options. To reduce prices, we can either decrease workers' pay or 2, increase workers' productivity. Price reductions through productivity. Given the two routes to cutting prices, we want to know the path that dominates. Historically, the answer is that productivity has been king, and it's easy to understand why. Cutting prices with wage clawbacks elicits pushback from workers, but productivity gains? Everyone likes those. In a moment, I'll show you the tight connection between worker productivity and prices. But first, a word about measurement. Given how frequently economists blather about productivity, you'd think they would have a sound way to measure it, but they don't. Instead, economists dubiously equate productivity with income, leading to official data that's laced with toxic ideology. Since I refuse to use this sludge, I'm left devising my own measures of productivity, ones that are reasonably objective. The key to these objective measures is that they look for activities where we can use basic science to aggregate output. The energy sector is a good example. When the goal is to produce energy, the science of energetics leaves no wiggle room for ideology. It tells us exactly how to compare different resources. So it's in the energy sector where we'll measure productivity and connect it with prices. To make the connection, let's look at the price of oil. Today, many people assume that oil prices are driven by speculation, and to some extent that's true. But over the long term, the price of oil is set by something more mechanical, the rising productivity of oil and gas workers. Figure 5 shows the relation. Here the red line shows the indexed productivity of workers in the U.S. oil and gas sector. From 1865 to the early 1970s, this productivity rose by a factor of roughly 50. In contrast, the blue line shows the price of oil, pegged against the average American income. Over the same period, this price dropped 50-fold. In short, oil got cheaper through rising productivity. Productivity through energy gluttony. It's at this point that energy enters the equation. That's because despite what mainstream economists preach, productivity gains don't flow magically from the workings of the free market. Instead, rising productivity is driven almost exclusively by the gluttonous use of energy. The reason is straightforward. Basic physics tells us that making stuff takes energy, and so making more stuff takes more energy. Put another way, when people get more productive, it's largely because they've subcontracted the tough work to energy slaves. For example, a locomotive driver can haul millions of times more stuff than someone hauling a handcart. But this productivity boost isn't magic. It's underwritten by the locomotive's profligate use of diesel fuel. Returning to the U.S. oil sector, we know that over the 20th century, oil and gas workers got vastly more productive. Unsurprisingly, this productivity was no miracle. It was underwritten by energy gluttony. Figure 6 runs the numbers. As U.S. oil and gas output per worker grew, the blue curve, so did the energy consumed per worker, the red curve. The message is that when it comes to rising productivity, there are no shortcuts. It's energy all the way down. The energetics of house manufacturing. Back to our main story, the long-term trend in U.S. house prices. The point of my sidetrack into energetics was to make the connection between energy and prices. In the U.S. oil business, cheaper prices were driven by rising productivity, which in turn was driven by energy gluttony. We expect the same to be true with house prices. And it is. The catch is that with housing, I'll cut out the productivity middleman because I don't think construction productivity can be measured objectively. So I'll jump straight from energy use to house prices. Actually, there's another catch, which is that I'll compare U.S. house prices to the energy used in U.S. industry. Industry consists of the sum of agriculture, mining, construction, and manufacturing. Here's why this comparison makes sense. Although we typically say that houses are constructed, it's more apt to say that they are manufactured and then assembled. In other words, if you look at a modern house, you'll find a wide array of industrially made components. Things like lumber, concrete, pipes, hose, drywall, paint, windows, shingles, wiring, not to mention thousands of screws and nails. To make houses cheaper, the construction business must get more productive at assembling housing components. But in addition, the whole industrial supply chain must get more productive at pumping out the required parts and materials. And since productivity is underwritten by physical work, we expect that the affair will be visible in the Book of Energy. Let's read the story. As Figure 7 demonstrates, there's a tight connection between cheapening U.S. house prices and rising energy use per worker in U.S. industry. The message is that Americans made houses more affordable by throwing energy at the problem. And when this energy throwing stagnated, houses stopped getting cheaper. It's that simple. The debt antagonist. Of course, the story of U.S. house prices doesn't end here. That's because if energy is the protagonist of our tale, then debt is the antagonist. Let me explain. When consumers are given access to credit, they have the option to use debt to bid up prices. For example, I could walk into Walmart and, with my credit card in hand, offer to buy bananas for double their listed price. True, the strategy sounds insane when applied to bananas, but when applied to houses, debt-driven bidding is standard fare. In other words, house buyers routinely make bids based on the amount of credit they can procure. As such, we expect that house prices will be connected to levels of household debt. Perhaps more than any other thinker, it's renegade economist Steve Keen who's made the connection between prices and debt. For example, in a piece called Your Margin and Your Life, Keen shows how the recent rise of U.S. house prices corresponds to a conspicuous buildup of household debt. To continue the story of U.S. house prices, I'm going to extend Keen's analysis back in time. Figure 8 shows the results. Over the last century, changing U.S. house prices were tightly coupled to changing levels of American household debt. A tale of energy and debt. At this point, our house price story has two main characters. The protagonist is industrial energy use, which drives prices down, and the antagonist is household debt, which drives prices up. Now, it would be naive to think that these two characters are the only factors affecting U.S. house prices. That said, the evidence suggests that energy and debt dominate the story. Figure 9 makes the case. Here, the red curve is a model of U.S. house prices based solely on historical levels of industrial energy use and household debt. The model explains about 90% of the variation in U.S. house prices. In short, energy and debt may not be the only factors affecting U.S. house prices, but they seem to be the most important players. Reopening the case of short supply. With energy and debt in hand, let's return to the case of a short housing supply. Back in Figure 4, I showed you that construction rates correlate with the trend in U.S. house prices, but I remain skeptical that the house price story began and ended with a mismatch between supply and demand. The truth is that part of my skepticism was driven by an ace up my statistical sleeve. You see, I'd already run the numbers below and found that in the context of energy and debt, rates of U.S. construction have virtually no ability to explain house prices. Let's have a look at this evidence. It's based on something called partial correlation, the correlation between two variables once the modeled effects of other variables has been removed. Looking at U.S. house prices, I've identified three possible causes. 1. Levels of industrial energy use. 2. Levels of household debt. And 3. Levels of construction relative to population growth. To run a partial correlation, we take one of these factors and measure its correlation with U.S. house prices after having removed the modeled effects of the other two factors. The purpose of this type of analysis is less to establish causation and more to disprove it. You see, if a correlation vanishes when put in the context of other variables, then the factor in question is unlikely to be a cause. And as it turns out, that's exactly what happens with the construction data. Figure 10 does the math. Here, each column shows the correlation between U.S. house prices and the variable on the horizontal axis. The blue columns show the standard univariate correlation, and the red columns show the partial correlation, the correlation once the modeled effects of the other two variables has been removed. What interests us is the difference between the blue and red columns, the change in correlation once we introduce context. On that front, the correlation for energy use hardly changes, while the correlation for household debt dramatically switches from negative to positive. But what's most important is the data on the right, the collapsing evidence that house prices are driven by a supply shortage. When we put construction rates in the context of energy and debt, their ability to explain house prices all but vanishes. The message is that stagnating construction is almost surely not what's driving the long-term trend in U.S. house prices. A supply chain problem. In many ways, the key to a good brainworm is its ability to evoke circular logic. On that front, appeals to a housing supply shortage are consistently circular. When people refer to a housing shortage, they typically mean that there's a shortage of affordable homes. But that's just another way of saying that houses are expensive. Since this circularity goes largely unnoticed, it leads to numerous oxymorons. For example, a recent CBC article complains that, quote, in the midst of a housing supply crisis, thousands of condos in Canada's largest cities are sitting empty. Tortured rhetoric aside, what the authors mean is that despite a glut of empty condos, prices are still unaffordable. And so we're back to square one. If it's not a supply shortage, then what's making houses so expensive? The evidence suggests that the problem is less about supply and more about the limits of supply chains. Unlike how we conjure money from nothing, humans cannot will housing into existence. Instead, houses are built by tirelessly wrenching resources from the earth and transforming them, bit by bit, into the thing we call home. The process takes a tremendous amount of work, most of which is done cheaply by the energy from fossil fuels. For much of the 20th century, Americans were able to make houses cheaper by ramping up the energy subsidy that went into their creation. But since the early 1970s, that subsidy has plateaued, and in my mind, it's unlikely to resume rising. So today we sit at an impasse. If we can't throw energy at the problem, how else can we make houses cheaper? Why, by cutting wages, of course. The offshored house? A quick trip to Walmart shows that American businesses are adept at cutting prices by slashing wages. And no, I don't mean the crappy wages paid to Walmart's staff. I mean the rock bottom wages paid to the army of offshore workers who make the stuff that Walmart sells. It's a nifty trick. If a pesky minimum wage stops you from cutting domestic pay, just move your whole supply chain elsewhere. Turning to houses, IKEA has successfully offshored the production of home furnishings. Perhaps the same principle could be applied to whole homes? Well, shipping houses across land and sea would create obvious logistical problems. But let's ignore these issues and focus on more fundamental limits to offshoring. The dirty secret behind offshoring is that it makes commodities cheaper only if domestic wages remain high. In other words, Walmart is able to hawk cheap imported stuff only to the extent that Americans earn much more than the offshore workers who made the goods. But if American wages decline, then the offshore-made stuff will no longer appear cheap. As it turns out, this domestic wage decline is already happening. The consequence is that for the poorest Americans, it's not just houses that are getting more expensive. The price of everything is going up. Figure 11 makes the case. Here, the line shows the price of consumer items benchmarked against the income of the 10th American percentile. For these folks, nearly everything has been getting more expensive since the 1980s. In short, for the poorest Americans, offshoring didn't work. Requiem for an American Dream. It's at this point that tech optimists would feel obliged to highlight an easy technological solution to our housing woes, but I won't offer one because I don't think it exists. If anything, the house price problem is more severe than we might think. You see, while house prices are rising slowly against the average American income, they're exploding relative to the income at the bottom. For the poorest tenth of Americans, houses are now as expensive as they were at the turn of the 20th century. Figure 12 runs the alarming numbers. In short, if the goal is ever cheaper housing, then in my mind, there is no solution. This version of the American dream is dead, and we should let it rest in peace. But that doesn't mean all is lost. Whether cheap or expensive, having a place to live is a basic human right, and long before people wielded the power of fossil fuels, we found ways to house our fellow humans. I'm sure we can do it again. We just need to stop believing that the market will do it automatically. Left alone, the market will do what it always does. Give the rich what they want and take from the poor as much as they can suffer. Speaking of taking from the poor, have you noticed how governments are responding to the housing crisis by penalizing the unhoused? It's as if the ruling class is clueless to the problem. Well, in a real sense, they are clueless. You see, from the vantage point of the American top 1%, there is no housing affordability crisis. For these wealthy folks, house prices continue to decline relative to income, as Figure 13 shows. So while the ruling class basks in cheap housing, they ignore the affordability problem by outlawing its victims. And that brings me to a reasonable solution to the housing crisis. While we can't build ever cheaper homes, the world doesn't have enough energy, we can make homes more affordable to the working class. To do it, we need to, paradoxically, ignore house prices and instead focus on income. The root driver of the housing crisis is that poor people can't afford to buy houses or pay rent. And yet the rich have their cake and get to eat it too. Maybe, just maybe, if we took some of this money and gave it to the poor, then these folks could afford a place to live. Well, that's it for this post. If you enjoyed it and want to support more free-thinking, data-driven research about big issues, consider becoming a patron. You can sign up at economicsfromthetopdown.com/membership. And if you're interested in the data and methods behind this post, you can find a link in the notes. Until next time, I'm Blair Fix.